Hey there. So let's see if we can paint this this boat here. This is nice. I love to paint all kind of boats, but this is a really nice one. Some kind of fishing boat, I would suspect. It's got a nice sort of tall shape to it that I was attracted by, and yeah, boats are always nice to paint. I think I paint way too many of them, but they are, yeah, they're nice subjects. A lot of little interesting details, and they are usually have a lot of contrast in them. The sort of the bridge and the structures on top of the boats are usually quite bright white and really reflect the sun really nicely. And then obviously you have boats sitting on water with some opportunity to paint some nice reflections, and we all love those, of course. So I'm just putting in the base drawing in here, capturing the overall shapes. I'm really not that good at drawing, but I put some effort into try and get the main shapes right, and sort of structure and perspectives and stuff. Here you see me putting in this mast of this sailboat in the background, and in the reference photo you can see that mast is almost in the middle of the picture, so I moved that mast to the right because I don't want that thing to sort of split the whole thing down the middle. Putting in these ropes here now, and those will be quite important to sort of tie the picture together, so we don't have a lot of disconnected shapes floating around in the middle of the painting. Not putting in a huge amount of detail, just the stuff that I sort of want to remember to put in, and then just a general location of various details and things. So I'm wetting the paper for this painting. I don't always do this, but in this particular painting I want to start out with the base paint in wet. So I'm soaking the whole paper. And this is Saunders Waterford paper, quarter sheet, cold press. I'm using a cloth here to remove some excess water in some places where I don't want the pigments to bleed as much. So I'm sort of drying the paper strategically in some places. And now I'm going in with some general warm hue. Got some yellow ochre and some red, perhaps some burnt umber going there. Using a secondary kind of color here. This boy here is quite bright orangey, so I want to make sure that comes out real bright in painting. So I'm using a secondary pigment there. I think it's Windsor orange. And yeah, putting some of the stuff that's got a bright color in the painting, so I got that in the base layer. So obviously this red here on this boat in the background is quite important. I could put this in a later wash, sort of wet on dry, but I want to try and see how it works out to put it in at this stage, wet in wet. Also starting to add in some of the colder bluish hues in the background here. There's a ship in the background, and also this sort of warmish, grayish tone of the pier that we're standing on when we're looking at this subject. These masts on the ship in the background are sort of bright yellow, so I'm using some I got some lemon yellow going there, but otherwise I'm using quite limited palette. So I'm not going to use a huge variety of hues, just trying to work with some red, some blue, some brown. Stick to a limited palette and work with that. So I'm just tidying things up here a little bit, where the pigments have bled out a bit too much. I'm gonna use a hairdryer every now and then to dry up the bit between the washes, to speed up the process a little bit, mostly. So here I'm putting in some masking fluid over these masts and rigs in the background. Normally don't do that a lot, but it's going to come in handy in this painting later on. And next up here I'm adding a wash here to just make sure that the reflections in the water here are a little bit more dull than the things that get reflected in the water. you don't have like 100% of the light reflecting back, so you need to dull it down a little bit. And I'm mixing up some darker values here. I'm using quite a lot of French ultramarine, and mixing it with quite a bit of cobalt turquoise when I want to go blue or greenish. And then I start adding in the darker shapes and the shadows in the painting here. Not trying to obsess with detail, just putting in the major shapes, and I can go back and add and refine things later. I just want to get the key features in, like this cast shadow beneath the bridge here on the fishing bow. I also need to put in a second wash here on this larger ship in the background to make sure it really stays in the background, and also helps add contrast so that the fishing boat with its bright white bridge and other things really pop out. So start working on the hull here. I have made a quite rich, deep bluish mix here of French ultramarine and some turquoise and some neutral tint. I'm trying to get this wash sufficiently dark that I don't need to go over it again later. It's always difficult to go dark enough and deep enough here, but if you can, it's good. It will look much cleaner and fresher in the end. Adding another wash of red here, because I did not go red enough in the first wash. Back and complete the hull here. And while I have some dark pigment on my brush, I'm just putting a few of these details here. I'm going to add more details later, but yeah, I guess I just felt like it. And then I'm just softening this edge here between the dark shaded side of the fishing boat, so that it sort of bleeds together with the ship next to it in the background. So it's time to paint the sky now, and I'm doing this in the second wash because it's really quite a dark element in the subject. And I'm using French ultramarine and mixing that with cobalt turquoise to get a sort of increasingly warm shade of blue. And because I used that masking fluid before, I can go left to right, right to left, and not worry about painting around those masts on the ships there. Which is good, because it's hard to make a smooth wash while you're trying to paint around details like that. I do, however, need to paint around the bridge on the fishing boat and the ship in the background. And then we put in some trees here. There's an island in the background with a lot of trees on it, and it's also got a small shipyard. So you can see some white from some ships that are anchored and next to this island. We're not going to paint those ships, but we're going to indicate them as sort of these bright blobs. Some wet and wet here to add some more texture to the trees in the background, and then I'm putting in the water in between the island and our subject, and trying to go sufficiently dark here and have a strong blue in my brush. Now the fun part. So we're going to paint the reflections and the water in the foreground. So I got a really rich mixture in my brush, and trying to keep the brushwork as calligraphic as possible and not fiddle around too much. Just thinking about spacing these waves somewhat realistically, and essentially painting negatively to around those reflections from the bright hull of the boat that's next to our fishing boat. And while doing this, I have to remind myself not to overdo things and put in too many brush strokes. You almost need to think that you have a budget of X brush strokes that you can't exceed. And this part of the painting here next to the ship, everything's in shades, you need to go quite dark. And while things are still wet, I put in a second wash here of even darker blue to improve the sense of waves and reflections. And of course some shadow on this buoy here, so it looks round. It's a big sphere, so just final touches here, trying not to overdo things with the reflections. But again, exploit that the wash is still wet, so I can do some things to it still. It's also important to go sufficiently dark towards the bottom of the picture here, so we have sort of darker values in the corners of the painting and lighter in the middle. And yeah, I have some dark pigment on my brush, so I take the opportunity to put in some of it in places where I need to go darker, some dots and details. Constantly thinking about contrast and trying to emphasize the right things in the subject. So trying to do something of the pier here, it's not a great point of interest or anything. You shouldn't overdo it. Trying different things here, I'm not sure what to make of it. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but at the same time we need some texture there to indicate the sort of cobblestone patterns on the ground. So now with some fresh thick turquoise on my brush, I put in some ropes. The cobalt turquoise is quite opaque, so you can paint on top of things with it quite well. Again, using neutral tint here to add even more slightly some details that are very, very, very dark. I realized I wanted this part here beneath the fishing boat, where the reflections and shadows sort of make the values need to be really dark there. And then I realized I had the pier here looked too flat, so I need to put in some different hues, I think. So I used some orange here to just vary the hues a little bit and bring some warmth to that part of the picture. Now I'm putting in some cast shadows. I'm imagining that we have some trees behind us casting shadows on the pier. That's not quite there in the reference photo, but I think it makes the subject come together better. It's also good to have a sense that you have stuff outside of your subject casting shadows into the subject. It creates a nice sense of presence, I think. Needed to go a little bit darker on those windows on the boat. Some bits and pieces here and there, some details, some cast shadows from these ropes. Make sure they really seem like they're there and not just floating around on top of things. Just strengthening some edges here, and again trying to improve the sense of a lot of details and stuff going on without really really knowing what those things, little details are, or caring about it, but creating a sensation of that. And also here emphasizing the pointy edge of that bow of the boat. So it's time to put in some of these thicker ropes here that again will hopefully tie the subject together. So there's one here that's quite dark, and there's a couple of in background, and they attach to some kind of things on the pier here, some iron thingies. Now for the fun part. So now I'm going to use a light opaque paint. This is not white, it's a light yellow or warmish white by Holbein. And I could use plain white, but I like to use this light yellow instead, especially when you have some warm sunlight hitting various surfaces. So I'm using this and a pointy synthetic brush to put in some details. And here I'm working on some rigging on this sailboat and what have you, all these tiny little details, just working with really dry brush marks and suggesting little details on things. Some more ropes here, and then we have a thick really bright rope here in the foreground. Again, I think this should help us tie things together a little bit, that you have these ropes cutting across the subject from right to left and left to right. And then there's this reflection here on the fishing boat hull that I again use this opaque light pigment with some water to it, just to indicate that reflection. Time to put in the riggings towards the sky here, so I'm going darker. And yeah, trying to be brave, not worry about painting crooked lines. Always a little bit scary, that part. Especially since it's one of the last things you do, so you have plenty of opportunity to ruin your painting. Even if it's successful this far, you can ruin it towards the end. But I think we got away with it. And yeah, some final details here on the pier, just suggesting these cobblestone textures without really trying to paint them, just putting in some lines and dots to indicate that there's something going on there. Some additional lines here, but again, not too many, not to go overboard. We don't want the spectator to study that part of the subject too much. It's the background, so it's just there. We just want to get across that we have a sailboat in the background and there's a lot of stuff going on. Finally, I'm removing the masking fluid here with a piece of cloth. And as you can see, that sailboat mast, it's quite bright now, so yeah, it's almost white here. So I'm gonna go in with some kind of brown mixture here and dull it down, and also try to make it look rounder. And that's about it. I think this will have to do. It's not much to add.